Hello, my name is Speer. I'm the project co-director at the ON360 project, and I'm here today to talk to you about our most recent paper published in the past week in partnership with the Ryerson Leadership Lab at Ryerson University. Its co-authors I'm pleased to have with me today, Sam, Andrey, and Tianna Follwell. And that paper, which you can find at our website, on360.ca, is called How to End Streaming in Ontario Schools. And we're grateful to both for the paper and to have you here alongside my project co-director, Drew Fagan, to unpack some of the key insights in the paper, including the evolution of streaming in Ontario secondary schools, some of the obstacles that have precluded policymakers from reforming the system, and then ultimately an action plan to move in the direction of de-streaming and support education equity in provincial secondary schools. Tianna and Sam, maybe just start with the basic question. What is streaming and why do we have it? And what's the sort of background to the evolution of streaming? And then I guess most importantly, why write this paper now? Why does there seem to be some momentum in the direction of reform, and how can your paper help sort of galvanize and focus that momentum to produce better educational outcomes for Ontario high school students?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. Thank you, Drew and Sean, for having us. So academic streaming is the process of dividing students into differentiated streams of curriculum and schooling based on perceived academic ability or based on previous achievement. And when we think historically about streaming and how it's manifested currently, we can think back, and there's always been kind of different types of schooling for different kinds of people. If we think about segregated schooling, if we think about residential schools, even the implementation of the common school back in the 1800s, right? So that's kind of how I guess this is kind of manifested. And initially with the implementation of vocational schools throughout like the 1960s, it was very class divided in terms of who would attend university institutions and who would attend like vocational or training schools. So now what we have currently in Ontario is a basic kind of 3-level, which is academic, which is a university like prep, applied, which is college level, and then essentials or locally developed, which is kind of like a workplace end pathway. So those 3 streams are kind of rooted in the outcomes for different students and where they would best be suited. So yeah.
In terms of why now, there has been a growing sort of chorus of criticism of how this has been implemented and manifested in Ontario schools. People in Ontario are often surprised to learn that Ontario starts streaming in grade 9, and that Ontario is the only province to do so. Almost all provinces start in grade 10 or later, and even the majority only do it in select courses like math or science. Things like English, for example, are often never streamed, whereas Ontario streams starting in grade 9 all core courses, meaning English, math, science, but even French, geography, history, a whole variety. And the implications of that are that, to Tianna's point, Black, Indigenous, low-income, students with special needs, many different forms of marginalized students are disproportionately in the applied stream and are underrepresented in who graduates from high school, who goes on to post-secondary education. It is not as if these streams have equitable outcomes in it, and if you go into applied, you transition to college at equitable rates. 1 in 4 don't graduate high school at all, compared to just 5% in the academic stream. And these streams were intended to be, you can mix and match based on your learning skills and styles, but in reality, the vast majority take only one type of course. Once you've taken grade 9 English and math, only 3% make it to university. So, right from the decisions you're making in grade 8, basically the amount of track switching or stream switching is very small. And so there's been a growing amount of criticism over this that's built over the years. Minister Lecce, the Minister of Education, announced last July that they would begin the process of de-streaming grade 9 math classes starting this September, which was welcome news, though many people have many questions about, why math, how fast will they do the other courses, if at all? And the curriculum, the de-streamed curriculum, has not yet been released, and it's almost the end of the school year now. And so we decided to put this out basically to lay out what we think a successful plan could look like.
So I think the paper's really timely in the context of what you just noted, both of you. Sam, your point about the initiative by the minister with regard to de-streaming math. But in the paper, you also talk about some of the history. And I'm interested, I think we're interested, viewers would be interested in why Ontario's an outlier. And you go back, I guess, a generation now a little bit. Maybe you could one of you could talk a little bit about that and previous efforts and how we ended up being, we here in Ontario, really, as I say, the outlier, because that was one of, I think people would be surprised by that we're really alone with regard to not just the way we stream, but how early we stream.
Right.
Yeah, I can.
Yeah, go.
Sure, I could start. So in the case of Ontario, there was an attempt to de-stream in the early 90s. I believe there was a different form of streaming prior to the 1990s. That was, I believe it's the OSIS, Ontario Secondary, Intermediate Secondary.
Yeah, it was the
I'm already butchering
basic,
it.
General Advanced Basic. And
that's before my time.
And unlike now, from what I understand, I mean, you guys probably went to school under this because I think it was from the 60s on. It was, you picked one stream. You didn't mix and match courses. It was, everything was at the general, advanced, or basic level. Is that right? Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, that sounds
I
right.
think so.
I went to secondary school in that framework. And I took advanced courses at the time, of course. But I didn't think of it as making a life-altering decision. And I think one of the things that the paper shows is that whether it's the old framework or the current framework, we're in effect forcing on 14-year-old kids choices that will have life-altering impacts in terms of the pathway that they're on. And so maybe as you're talking,
and earlier than others do.
Exactly. So maybe as you're talking about Ontario's position relative to some of the other provinces, maybe Sam, if you can unpack a bit, you said in your first answer that there's a really low incidence of people moving back and forth between streams. These really do become, pathways that are virtually impossible to change direction. So maybe on both those points, if you can share your thoughts.
And sorry, Tianna, I cut you off in the 90s. So let's finish that thought first.
Sure, no worries. So there was an attempt to de-stream in the 90s that included like a really large curriculum overhaul. And this was all in the midst of a severe economic recession and a lot of tensions between government and unions, teachers' unions. So it's, to summarize it, it was so much so fast and really not really a stable foundation in terms of implementation, which I think, is why we, in this paper really encourage those foundational and steadfast implementation steps in kind of looking at a comprehensive and well-rounded implementation process this time around.
But I do want to point out, so it was an NDP government at the time, and they gave school boards 3 years to de-stream grade 9. And evidence was in the 2 years that it was implemented that there was some modest progress in terms of higher credit accumulation, graduation, et cetera. But yeah, the new government came in 1995, and based on kind of negative reaction from teachers who didn't feel supported in implementing this, decided to end that implementation, and they brought in the system that's here today, academic, applied, and essential, and it's basically stayed in place unaltered since 1999 when it was formally put in place. There have been criticisms, of course, throughout, but it really wasn't until 2017. I should say largely rooted in criticism from Toronto's Black community that really kind of began the chorus about the racist the kind of manifestations of the policy, that the ministry acknowledged the concerns and said that they were going to look at it. And then again, an election in 2018, Liberal government, unelected, the new government came in. And so to this government's credit, they've, picked up that ball. But I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned from that history of false starts, right? Which is a lack of support. You're really asking teachers to teach in a fundamentally different way. High school teachers are, taught about these levels and the different pedagogy styles, and sort of mix classes in a new way can kind of challenge some of their, core beliefs about how they do their job, right? And so it takes work, it takes training, even, things as basic as textbooks and lessons plans, and there's work to do this. It's not as if you can just flick a switch. So I think there is a lot of growing concern, especially about the timeline now that the government has not yet released the curriculum, that we're repeating basically the exact same mistakes that were made in '93.
Well, let me just pick that up, because the paper, I think, makes two separate yet related insights. The first is there ought to be a higher level of ambition in terms of de-streaming. As you say, the government has signaled in its intention to de-stream grade 9 math, but has been silent on a broader set of classes and kind of the underlying philosophy of de-streaming more generally. But on the other hand, you caution the need for, in effect, an action plan so that there's real stickiness in these reforms, that we don't have the same experience we've had in the past where, the reforms fail for various reasons. Do you want to maybe just start to unpack both the kind of major impediments to an effective de-streaming agenda and maybe some of the key recommendations in your view that will increase the probability that current plans for de-streaming can be ultimately successful?
Do you want to start?
No, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. So I think one of our core recommendations is that, we need a more coherent plan rooted in some consultation, genuine consultation with communities, with teachers, with parents and students, to expand beyond math. There was some suggestion basically that the ministry was already rewriting the grade 9 math curriculum because the PC government had come in promising math curriculum reform. And so it was basically easy for them to piggyback on it and say, do this too at the same time. But, math is not the only core subject that streaming becomes an impediment in. Especially English and science are key gatekeepers to switching pathways. And so we recommend that a more coherent kind of medium-term plan on how to end streaming in grades 9 and 10 get put in place in consultation with the education community. And the reason we say 9 and 10 is not to say you will eventually need to split people up. It's, you cannot have elementary style education throughout. We understand you'll eventually go on to different post-secondary pathways that require different preparation. But there's a lot of lessons to be learned from other provinces, other jurisdictions, where they emphasize differentiating by discipline, not by ability. And what I mean by that is, yes, we should probably differentiate math into calculus and geometry, and we should differentiate science into biology and chemistry, but not to judge a student's ability to do any of those things ahead of time. And so that's sort of the proposal, but we accompany that with some other recommendations to make this, to your point, stickier, which it requires some investment in training, like I mentioned, and also we're asking the school system to do this and really change the way it's been organized for a long time. There are going to be students coming from grade 8 not prepared to succeed in mixed ability classes. And that's going to require some either special education resources or bridging resources, or else it may be a kind of a net negative for those students. And so I think there's lots to be done. And I also want to say there's a political risk, like small p political risk, which is a lot of the advocacy around this is centered in the GTA. It's where the TDSB has been collecting race-based data for a long time, and it's where the advocacy really started. I'm worried, in the Waterloos and Londons and Sudburys of Ontario, who are being asked to implement this with very little support this September, that the backlash could again undermine progress further.
So you add that absolutely, and you note is as a potential risk. At the same time, and I'm wondering about the degree to which this has to be province-wide and the degree to which this can be done on a school board to school board basis, because you do note in the paper a couple of examples of other school boards that have taken steps in and of themselves, given their lack of satisfaction with the degree to which Queen's Park has been willing to take that on. So maybe you want to just cite that as the corollary to the risk you just mentioned.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as you say, several school boards, TDSB being among them, have move forward with a form of de-streaming, which is just to stop offering applied, because they can't change the curriculum. It's not within their powers, but school boards do have, course offering power. And so they've phased out applied offerings and just have everyone take academic. And so that's a way to do it. There's a lot of momentum around that. There are school boards that are talking about doing that more, especially grade 9 English is a big movement on that front. And so, yeah, that's certainly a possibility. And we talk about in the paper too, in terms of the political risk, we don't want this to be a suggestion that we're dumbing down the curriculum for the 75% of the students who are in academic now. This is about supporting everybody to meet high expectations. And so what's nice about that model that the school boards have led is it's not a de-streamed curriculum. It's not a new thing that people should, be nervous about or afraid. It's just asking everybody to be academic and at that level. So there's a neatness to that. And we suggest too that the ministry should consider not calling this de-streamed math something different or like open, but just call it academic math. And so, yeah, I hope that answers the question.
In effect, what you're saying is that, the goal ought to be to level up, not level down. Not only I think that has kind of policy salience, I think it can help address some of those small p political risks that you've talked about.
It does have, policy salience, as you say, but at the same time, governments across the country and in Ontario have been emphasizing the need for students to go into apprenticeship roles, where there's going to be a desperate need, good jobs, well-paying jobs that have a little bit of a stigma around them. And the government itself has been, this government, very active with regard to that. So squaring that circle is a little challenging, isn't it? And you get into that a little bit into the paper as well.
Absolutely. And I think the thing with streaming is that it kind of goes both ways in the way that, university is the standard, academic is the standard. That's what everyone's trying to achieve. And if, a student who, is well performing, enrolled in academic, but really is super interested in mechanics and wants to pursue that and wants to pursue apprenticeship, there's already kind of like a class bias around that, or, that's just for the kids who don't do so well. That even though you can make great money doing like highly skilled trades. So I think there's just kind of this odd stigma. And really what, de-streaming is just opening students to the many possibilities, not, cutting off any pathways that they might want to pursue regardless of race or class or just about their interests and what they are passionate about.
I also think, like, this is just now my own personal opinion, but this like hands-on learning, the idea that this applied stream is really that, is a fiction, right? Like you go into these applied grade 9 English classrooms. It's not as if they're welding, right? Like it's, they're just reading books, right? Like, and so the notion that what we've set up is actually succeeding in encouraging the skilled trades is a fiction. And I think, to your point, Ontario is in last place amongst the provinces in terms of a number of registered apprentices,
Right.
yet is streaming earliest. So if streaming is working, we're doing something wrong. And so it's not to say that that shouldn't be top of mind, how to do this with skilled trades in mind. It's a really good flag, but the status quo is not what's working.
Or maybe put differently, there's no incompatibility with your paper's recommendations with respect to de-streaming and other work that we published at Ontario 360 about kind of strengthening vocational and technical education within the secondary school system.
Totally.
The idea here is that we ought to stop forcing on young children life-altering decisions at age 14 and 15. But later on in their secondary school career, we ought to make sure that that applied stream, or whatever one might call it, is a genuine pathway into the world of work. And presently, as you say, we have an advanced system that's well serving 75% of students, but we're underserving something like 25 or 30% of students who are in these other streams and not getting as much out of them as they ought to be. I mean, maybe just as a final reflection, we've talked a bit about some of the underlying equity concerns here. Maybe just unpack those. You mentioned, Sam, that the share of students who are in applied courses have low rates of post-secondary participation and so on. That has, all things being equal, implications for lifetime earnings and job precarity and these sorts of things. And you graphed onto that clear and obvious implications for racialized communities and so on. So, can you just maybe paint a picture for our audience? If Ontario policymakers adopted your recommendations and we headed on a medium-term path towards de-streaming, what would success look like in the province of Ontario? Maybe we should end with a kind of aspirational picture for policymakers and Ontarians more generally.
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. So maybe I'll just pick up on the equity piece. I mentioned them briefly, but I think some of the stats would shock people. So in the TDSB, 12% of students are Black, and in the applied stream, 40% of the students are Black. Like the gaps are significant. The same rate, the kind of ratio of 2 to 2.5 times representation or manifest in Peel, but the data ends there because Peel and Toronto are the only people asking students to self-identify by race. But we know from other evidence that low-income students are significantly more likely, or low-income schools, I should say, are significantly more likely to have more students in applied. Indigenous students, English language learners. There's a bunch of evidence that these things map onto existing socioeconomic and class divides. And so I think what this could look like, what would success look like, is that all students are supported in grades 9 and 10 to achieve high expectations, pursue and think about different post-secondary pathways, and then in grades 11 and 12, a higher proportion of equity-seeking groups are set up for success to pursue whatever pathways they want. And it's not to say that some won't, and many won't end up exactly as Drew was saying in skilled trades or in college. These are great pathways to be on, but you shouldn't decide it at age 13. And if you then want to change your mind, face all sorts of barriers, is I think at the end of the day what this is all about. Tianna, I don't know if you want to add anything there.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that ties nicely with, one of our last recommendations about accelerating the provincial student identity data collection process and reporting, because monitoring and evaluation and data analysis is going to be critical to ensuring that those targets are being met, and that every part of the institution and government is being held accountable for the changes we're making, and that those changes are actually producing positive results for those most impacted.
Drew, do you have any final thoughts or comments as someone who's spent time in the provincial government? What is your sense of the momentum around this issue, particularly given the kind of growing attention paid to questions of inequality, questions about some of the outcomes associated with different racialized communities? Do you think that there's room for progress after so many stops and starts over the years?
Well, thanks, Sean. And think of it as well, this has been a challenge for decades, as you set out in the paper, but at the same time, different impacts from the pandemic as well have brought to bear in striking ways the inequalities, across the Greater Toronto area and across the province, right? And so, it is interesting to me that this government has been willing to take the step with regard to math. And essentially what you're doing through the paper is encouraging them to move further and providing guidance with regard to how that can be done well. And in a context where Ontario is the outlier. Ontario really is the outlier. So whether this happens, in the near term or, takes a little bit longer given all the, the other priorities that the government has. And Sean, to your point, like government is filled with priorities all the time. It is something that is being considered within the government, I'm sure, given the steps that are already underway towards the fall. So, great initiative, great thinking on your part.
Yeah, Sam and Tianna, let me just say on behalf of Drew and the rest of the Ontario 360 team, how proud we are to publish this paper and partner with the Ryerson Leadership Lab and its promotion and dissemination. I think the paper sets out effectively that there are equity, efficiency, and even kind of normative arguments for why we need to stop moving slowly on this issue and start to make real progress. And as Tianna says, put behind it, or underneath it rather, a kind of solid foundation to ensure that de-streaming has real durability as an important policy reform. So thank you so much. Viewers, thank you for tuning in for another episode of our policy discussions here at Ontario 360. You can find Tianna and Sam's paper at ontario360.ca. Along with others that we've published over the past several months on issues associated with transit-oriented communities, fiscal federalism, skilled trades and apprenticeships, as we talked about earlier. And in the coming days and weeks, we'll have forthcoming papers on manufacturing, digital infrastructure, and a number of other issues that will be so relevant, not just to coming out of the immediacy of the pandemic, but laying the foundation for greater opportunity and prosperity in the province of Ontario. And it seems to me, if the Ontario government or subsequent Ontario governments move forward with Tianna and Sam's recommendations to achieve de-streaming, that'll be a crucial ingredient in such a long-term vision for the province. Thank you so much.